A stranger stopped me on a rainy Tuesday, leaned in close, and whispered, "Ma, and thank you for saving my life. Tomorrow everything will change." Then he simply walked away. I thought he had the wrong person. I had never seen him before in my life. But the next morning, my bank app flashed a notification that stopped the air in my lungs. A deposit of $24 million. The sender was that exact same stranger. But before I could even process the reality of that number, a second notification popped up. Court-ordered freeze. Every cent I owned was suddenly gone. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that no amount of money gives anyone the right to bully you. I am Chloe Bennett. I am 38 years old and I live in Chicago. My life has never been defined by wealth. It has been defined by survival and strict routine. I am a 911 dispatcher. For 12 years, I have spent my nights sitting in a windowless room, listening to the worst moments of people's lives. I have talked mothers through CPR, I have kept hostages calm while police breached buildings, and I have listened to the final breaths of strangers. You learn very quickly in my line of work that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. You learn to detach, to assess, and to act. That morning I was standing in aisle 4 of a local Target, holding a generic brand of laundry detergent and a box of clearance granola bars. My total was $34.12. I swiped my debit card. The machine let out a sharp, ugly beep. Declined. I felt a brief flash of heat at the back of my neck. I stepped out of the line, apologizing to the cashier with the practiced smile of someone used to apologizing for things out of her control. I pulled out my phone, assuming my auto pay for the electric bill had cleared early and overdrawn my account. My mortgage payment was due in 5 days, and my ex-husband had conveniently forgotten to send his half of the shared debt again. I was always balancing on a financial tightrope. I opened the banking app expecting to see a negative balance. Instead, the screen loaded, and my usual balance of $214 was gone. In its place was a string of digits that made absolutely no sense. $24,214. Underneath it, the transaction read incoming wire transfer, Elias Thorne Trust. I stared at the screen. I did not scream. I did not drop my phone. The training took over immediately. But then right at the top of the screen, a bright red banner appeared. It read, "Account restricted. Legal hold applied. Contact your branch immediately." They had not just frozen the $24 million. They had frozen my $214. They had frozen my ability to buy laundry detergent. They had frozen my ability to put gas in my car. I walked out of the store into the biting wind of a Chicago morning. I did not have my groceries. I had a phone with a frozen screen and a mind racing through variables. Elias Thorne. The name echoed in my head. I recognized it from the local news. He was a venture capital billionaire who had just passed away a few days ago. Why would his trust send me $24 million? And more importantly, who had the power to freeze a federal bank account within seconds of a transfer? I reached the parking lot. My car was an old Toyota Camry, reliable, but showing its age. As I approached, my situational awareness flared. 2 men were standing near my rear bumper. They were wearing expensive charcoal suits that absolutely did not belong in a suburban Target parking lot on a Wednesday morning. One of them was holding a phone, clearly taking pictures of my license plate and the inside of my car. They wanted me to see them. This was not a covert surveillance job. It was a message. Intimidation is a clumsy tool used by people who are accustomed to getting their way without a fight. I did not alter my pace. I did not speed up, and I certainly did not slow down. I walked straight to my driver's side door, unlocked it, and slid in. I locked the doors, turned the key, and let the engine hum. I looked at them through the glass. The taller one gave me a smirk, the kind of smile meant to make a woman feel small and isolated. I did not smile back. I pulled out of the parking spot and drove away. Before I even reached the main road, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown local number. Most people would ignore it. I answered. "Miss Bennett," a man's voice said. It was smooth, polished, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I am calling on behalf of the Thorne estate. My name is immaterial right now. What is material is the catastrophic mistake made by our banking institution this morning." I kept my eyes on this road. I did not say a word. In my line of work, silence is a tactic. When a caller is frantic or trying to control the narrative, you let them speak into the void until they stumble. The lawyer paused, clearly expecting me to stammer, to ask questions, or to panic. When I gave him nothing, his tone shifted slightly, dropping the polite veneer. "I assume you have seen your bank account, Miss Bennett. You need to understand that the $24 million you are currently looking at does not belong to you. It is the result of a clerical error exacerbated by a dying man's diminished mental capacity. We have already secured a preliminary injunction to freeze your assets." Still, I said nothing. The traffic light turned red. I stopped the car and watched the pedestrians cross the street. "Are you listening to me?" He snapped, his irritation bleeding through. "We are prepared to make this very painful for you. You are a civil servant. You have a mortgage on a house that is underwater. You live paycheck to paycheck. If you attempt to claim this money, we will bury you in litigation until you cannot afford to feed yourself. Sign the waiver. I am about to email you, return the funds, and perhaps we will unfreeze your original $200. I took a slow, deep breath. I channeled the exact voice I use when I have a barricaded suspect on the line or a mother holding a child who is not breathing. Flat, authoritative, utterly immovable. "You made a mistake," I said. "Excuse me," he replied. "You made a mistake calling my personal cell phone to issue a threat." I said, my voice steady. "You made a mistake sending 2 men in cheap suits to photograph my car in a public parking lot. And you made a catastrophic mistake assuming that freezing my grocery money would make me compliant." There was silence on the other end. Real silence. "I do not know why Elias Thorne sent me that money," I continued, enunciating every word. "But I know that billionaires do not make $24 million clerical errors, and I know that if you had the legal high ground, you would be sending me a court summons, not a couple of goons and an anonymous phone call. You have 30 seconds to unfreeze my personal funds, or my next call is to the Illinois Attorney General to report a coordinated campaign of financial extortion." I hung up. I did not wait for his response. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. My hands were perfectly steady. They had tried to trigger a panic response, hoping I would fold under the sudden weight of a frozen life, but they did not know who they were dealing with. I spend 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, navigating the worst days of people's lives. I am the voice in the dark that tells people how to survive when the monsters are already inside the house. I looked at the road ahead. The $24 million was not a mistake. It was a declaration of war, and whoever was trying to hide the truth had just picked a fight with the wrong woman. I pushed my empty shopping cart back into the corral and pulled my coat tight against the bitter Chicago wind. The parking lot was mostly empty, but my eyes immediately locked onto my 10-year-old Toyota Camry. 2 men were standing right next to it. They were not just passing by, they were waiting. They wore tailored charcoal suits that cost more than my entire car, and they stood with that specific kind of relaxed arrogance that wealthy men hire to do their dirty work. One of them was holding up a phone, blatantly taking pictures of my license plate, my windshield, and the interior of my car. He did not try to hide it when he saw me approaching. That is the first thing you learn to notice when you work dispatch. People who are afraid of getting caught hide. People who want to terrorize you make sure you see them. This was an invasion. They wanted me to feel like my private life was suddenly a glass house. I did not slow my pace. I did not reach into my purse for my pepper spray. I walked directly toward my driver's side door with the heavy, measured steps of a woman who spends 40 hours a week directing police units to active crime scenes. I know what predators look like, and these 2 were just corporate bullies playing dress-up. The taller man lowered his phone and smirked at me. He stepped just close enough to violate my personal space, expecting me to flinch or look down. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. I hit the unlock button on my key fob, pulled the handle, and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors instantly. Before I could even put the key in the ignition, my cell phone rang through the car Bluetooth. It was an unlisted number. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. The men outside were watching me through the glass. I pressed the answer button on my steering wheel. "Miss Bennett," a voice said through the car speakers. The voice was smooth, highly educated, and dripping with condescension. "I am calling on behalf of the Thorne estate. We know exactly who you are, where you live, and what you do for a living." I kept my eyes fixed on the 2 men outside my car. I did not say a word. Silence makes arrogant people uncomfortable. It forces them to fill the void. "You are looking at a bank screen that says you have $24 million. The voice continued, his tone hardening. "But you and I both know that money is a mistake. My client has already secured a court order to freeze every single asset attached to your name. We have locked your checking account, your savings, and your credit cards. You are currently standing in a parking lot with absolutely nothing. So I strongly suggest you sign the release form I am sending to your email right now. Return the money before you cannot even afford to buy toilet paper." I felt a cold spike of anger, but I pushed it down. Anger makes you sloppy. I took a slow, deep breath, and I let my 911 dispatcher voice take over. It is a voice devoid of emotion, a voice that commands authority, because it refuses to negotiate with panic. "You sent 2 men in expensive suits to photograph my car," I said slowly, making sure every word cut through the speaker. "You froze an account with $200 in it, and you called a single woman to threaten her ability to buy basic necessities. You want me to feel hunted. But here's what you need to understand." I paused, watching the smirk fade from the man standing outside my window. "I spend 12 hours a day listening to people beg for their lives," I said. "I listen to domestic abusers break down doors. I listen to gunshots. I know what real danger sounds like. You do not sound dangerous. You sound panicked. You sound like a man who is terrified of what happens if I do not sign that paper." The line went dead silent. The polished lawyer had lost his script. "Tell your boys outside to step away from my vehicle," I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper, "because my next call is not to my bank, it is to dispatch. And I will tell them 2 unidentified men are attempting to hijack a city employee. We will see how much your boss likes the press coverage when his corporate thugs are arrested in a Target parking lot." I did not wait for his reply. I ended the call. I shifted the car into drive and hit the gas. The 2 men scrambled out of the way as I pulled out of the parking space. I looked in my rearview mirror and watched them standing there, the arrogance completely wiped from their faces. The war had just started, and they had already made their first fatal mistake. They underestimated me. Most people in my position would be hyperventilating right now. They would be sobbing, begging the voice on the phone to give them their life back. That is exactly what the lawyer on the other end of the line was waiting for. He wanted the tears. He wanted the frantic bargaining. He wanted the complete and total surrender of a woman who had just lost everything. But he got nothing, just the slow, steady rhythm of my breathing. He did not know that for the past 12 years, I have made a living out of staying calm while the world burns down. I am a 911 dispatcher. I have spent thousands of hours in a windowless room with a headset pressing into my ear, listening to the absolute worst moments of human existence. I have heard the frantic, gut-wrenching screams of mothers holding breathless children. I have heard the sharp, terrifying crack of gunshots echoing in the background of a domestic dispute. I have listened to the quiet, rattling sound of a stranger taking their very last breath on this earth, while I promised them help was on the way. When you are exposed to that level of raw, unfiltered terror every single night, a corporate lawyer threatening your bank account does not even register as a crisis. It is just another loud noise. My silence stretched through the phone line, thick and heavy. I could hear the faint rustle of paper on his end, then a sharp, unsteady exhale. The polished, arrogant man who had called to terrorize me was suddenly fumbling. His rhythm was broken. He had prepared a script for a hysterical victim. He had absolutely no idea how to handle a woman who simply refused to break. I arrived at the dispatch center at 5:45 the next morning. I swiped my badge at the security gate. The light turned red. A sharp buzz echoed in the quiet lobby. I tried again. Red light. Buzz. The security guard behind the glass looked at his monitor and then looked at me with a tight, uncomfortable expression. He picked up his phone. 2 minutes later, the director of human resources walked through the double doors. She did not look me in the eye. "Chloe, we need you to come upstairs," she said. We walked in silence to a sterile conference room on the 3rd floor. My union representative was already sitting at the table. That was when I knew the freeze on my bank account was only the beginning. Julian Thorne was not just trying to starve me out. He was systematically dismantling my entire life. The HR director opened a thin manila folder. "Early this morning, we received a formal complaint forwarded from the mayor office," she began. "It is an anonymous tip, but it contains highly specific allegations regarding your conduct as a city dispatcher." I sat perfectly still. My hands rested flat on the table. "What allegations?" I asked. The director cleared her throat. "The complaint alleges that you have been utilizing the city emergency data system to identify and target vulnerable elderly citizens living alone. It accuses you of extracting their personal financial information during crisis calls and using it for personal gain." The room went completely silent. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. Julian knew exactly how to trigger a mandatory administrative response. In my line of work, trust is the only currency that matters. An accusation of preying on the elderly while they were calling for help was not just a fireable offense. It was a criminal one. It would make me radioactive. No lawyer would want to touch my case. No judge would look at me with sympathy. "You and I both know I have never done that," I said, looking directly at the director. "Every keystroke I make is logged. Every call is recorded. We know that Chloe, my union rep, chimed in looking miserable. But with allegations, this severe involving data privacy and vulnerable populations, the city has a strict zero-tolerance protocol. An internal investigation has already been launched." The director closed the folder. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending the results of the investigation. You must surrender your city credentials. And because this involves potential criminal misconduct, the suspension is without pay." Without pay. My mind automatically did the math. I had a frozen bank account. I had a mortgage payment due in 4 days. And now I had exactly zero income. Julian Thorne had cut the final rope holding me above water. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of impending homelessness. He wanted me to realize that standing up to a billionaire in Chicago was a game I could not win. I stood up from the chair. I unclipped my city badge from my belt and placed it gently on the table. I did not argue. I did not plead for my job. When a building is collapsing, you do not stand inside and argue with the walls. You find the exit and you plan your next move. "I will cooperate fully with the investigation," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Tell whoever filed that complaint that I look forward to the discovery process." I walked out of the building and into the cold morning air. I had no money and no job. But as I looked at the city skyline, I realized Julian had made a critical error. He thought taking away my livelihood would make me weak. He did not realize he had just given me all the free time in the world to destroy him. I drove home in complete silence. The radio was off. The streets of Chicago blurred past my window, but my mind was entirely focused on the brutal math of my reality. My mortgage payment of $1,842 was scheduled for automatic withdrawal in exactly 4 days. Usually I would feel a brief moment of deep relief when that payment cleared, knowing I had secured the roof over my head for another 30 days. Now it was a ticking clock. When I walked into my house, the quiet felt heavy and suffocating. This house was the only thing I fought to keep in my divorce. It was small and the plumbing groaned in the winter, but it was mine. It was my absolute sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap closing in on me. Without my salary and with every single bank account completely frozen under a court order, I had absolutely zero ways to make that payment. The lending bank would not care about an anonymous HR complaint or a frozen billionaire trust fund. They only care about the numbers. Miss one payment and the penalty fees pile up. Miss two and the foreclosure process begins. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at a stack of mail I could not afford to open. Julian Thorne had orchestrated this with terrifying precision. He had pulled my credit report. He knew my exact financial breaking point. He knew that a working-class woman with a mortgage and a single income could not survive a sudden total loss of funds. He wanted to break me before I even had the chance to find a lawyer. He wanted the fear of being homeless to force me into submission. He wanted me out on the street sleeping in my car. I rested my head in my hands for just one moment. The sheer weight of the panic was sitting right on my chest, trying to force its way in. It would be so easy to just give up. It would be so easy to call his lawyer back and beg for the release form so I could just buy groceries and pay my electric bill. But then I lifted my head. I looked at the walls of my kitchen and felt the cold resolve settle back into my bones. I had survived a deeply toxic marriage. I had survived 12 years of answering the darkest phone calls in the city. I was not going to let a spoiled billionaire take my home without a war. I needed a plan, and I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. I was still sitting at the kitchen table staring at my unpaid bills when a sharp knock at the front door shattered the silence. I did not move at first. I half expected to see another pair of corporate thugs standing on my porch. But when I looked through the peephole, I felt the first real wave of relief I had experienced in 48 hours. It was Maya. Maya is my sister-in-law. She is a brilliant African-American woman who works as a forensic accountant. While I spend my days tracking down emergencies, she spends hers tracking down hidden money for corporate fraud cases. Maya does not do small talk, and she absolutely does not do empty sympathy. I unlocked the door, and she walked right past me into the kitchen. She did not offer a hug or a sad smile. Instead, she dropped a massive, thick manila folder right on top of my stack of bills. The heavy thud echoed in the small room. She looked dead in my eyes and told me that these bastards just woke up the wrong family. I sat back down as she pulled out a chair opposite me. Maya explained that Julian Thorne had made a massive tactical error by freezing my accounts. In his arrogance, he left a digital footprint. She had spent the last 10 hours pulling public financial records and tax filings connected to the Thorne estate. "They want to bleed you out fast because they are hiding something massive," Maya said, her voice razor-sharp. "They think because you are a working-class dispatcher, you will just fold under the legal pressure. But they do not know I am in your corner, and they definitely do not know who I am bringing into this fight." She slid a sleek black business card across the table. It had a single name printed in bold silver letters, Valerie Cruz. I asked who she was. Maya smiled, and it was a deeply dangerous kind of smile. She told me Valerie Cruz is the most terrifying estate litigation attorney in the entire city of Chicago. She is the woman you call when a billionaire tries to step on your neck. She is ruthless, she is brilliant, and she happens to owe Maya a very big favor. Maya tapped the thick folder on the table and told me to get my coat. She said we had a meeting in 20 minutes and we were going to burn their entire strategy to the ground. 2 days later, my doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock in the evening. I looked through the peephole and my muscles tightened instantly. It was not Maya. It was Julian Thorne. He stood on my front porch looking entirely out of place in his custom-tailored cashmere coat and polished designer shoes. He had the kind of calm, confident posture that only absolute generational wealth can buy. I opened the door before he could knock again. I did not invite him in. I simply stood in the doorway, blocking his path. He offered a polite, carefully rehearsed smile that did not reach his eyes. "May I come in, Miss Bennett?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured like a corporate executive closing a merger. "We really should talk like civilized adults." I stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside and pulled the door wide open. Let him walk into my trap. He stepped into my small living room, looking around with a subtle, clinical detachment, as if he were appraising a low-value asset. He did not wait for an offer. He walked straight over to my worn-out fabric sofa and sat down, crossing one leg over the other. He placed a sleek leather briefcase on my coffee table, unlatched it, and pulled out a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. A certified cashier check. He slid the check across the wood-grain surface toward me. The numbers written on it were crystal clear. $1 million. My grandfather. Elias was a complicated man near the end of his life, Julian said, his voice dropping into a soft, sympathetic register. His mind was slipping, Miss Bennett. He was giving away fortunes to people who meant nothing to our family. You are a smart woman. You know $24 million coming from a man with documented cognitive decline will never hold up in probate court. You will spend years fighting my legal team, and you will lose every single cent. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, locking his eyes onto mine. So here is my personal offer to you. $1 million tax-free. You sign a standard non-disclosure agreement and a waiver relinquishing all claims to the estate. You can pay off your mortgage today. You can quit your stressful dispatcher job and start completely over. It is a very generous exit package for someone who started this week with $200 in her checking account. I looked down at the check. $1 million. For the woman who had spent years worrying about grocery bills and utility cutoffs, that piece of paper represented absolute freedom. It was an easy way out of a war I was supposed to lose. I let the silence stretch across the room. Julian watched me, waiting for the exact moment greed or relief would soften my expression. He thought he had calculated every variable. He thought every person had a price tag. I slowly lifted my head and looked straight into his cold, calculated eyes. I did not smile. I did not blink. "You think you are very smart, Julian," I said, my voice flat and icy. "You think walking into my house with a $1 million check makes you the master of this room." His smile faltered just a fraction. His eyebrows pulled together in slight confusion. "I will not sign your waiver," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "And you can take your check and get out of my house, because the $24 million your grandfather gave me is not a mistake. And we both know it is the exact price of the secret you are trying so desperately to hide." The color drained from Julian's face. The polished billionaire facade cracked instantly, revealing the panicked predator underneath. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He realized right then and there that I was not a victim he could buy off. I was the storm coming to destroy him. Julian leaned back against the cushions and interlaced his fingers. The polite corporate mask completely melted away. He looked at me not as a person, but as a minor obstacle he simply needed to crush. "My uncle had lost his mind, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice dropping to a low and threatening whisper. He was suffering from severe paranoia and dementia in his final months. He was hallucinating enemies that did not exist. "Sign the document rejecting the $24 million. If you do, you walk away with $1 million right now. You get to keep this house. And I will make a single phone call to Human Resources to ensure you get your dispatch job back by tomorrow morning." He paused, letting the weight of his offer hang in the silent room. Then he leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us to make sure I felt the full force of his threat. "But if you refuse," he continued, his tone turning pure venom, "tomorrow morning, every major media outlet in this state will run the exact same headline. They will paint you as a manipulative leech who used her position in emergency services to prey on a wealthy, vulnerable old man. They will dig up your divorce records. They will interview your neighbors. They will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you will never work in public service ever again." I sat perfectly still, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. "Do not try to fight me in Chicago," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute terrifying certainty. "I own this city. I pay the politicians. I dine with the judges. You are a nobody sitting in a cheap house. You cannot win." I looked at the $1 million check sitting on my coffee table. It was a perfectly constructed psychological trap. He was offering me a financial lifeline while holding a loaded gun to my public reputation. He was giving me exactly one way out. For a brief second, the sheer scale of his power felt suffocating. He could ruin my life with a single phone call. He could turn the entire city against me. He expected me to cry. He expected me to tremble, reach for the pen, and surrender. But as I looked at his perfectly tailored suit and his arrogant smile, I did not feel fear. I felt absolute clarity. Julian Thorne was used to dealing with politicians and businessmen who cared deeply about their public image. He did not realize that I spent my entire career operating in the shadows. I did not care about newspaper headlines. I cared about the truth. I reached across the table. I did not pick up his pen. I did not look at his waiver. Instead, I placed my index finger on the crisp cashier check and slowly pushed it right back to his side of the table. I looked down at the piece of paper resting on my coffee table. $1 million. It was more money than I could ever save in 3 lifetimes on a dispatcher salary. It was the immediate end of my mortgage. It was the end of the crushing anxiety that sat heavily on my chest every single time I opened my mailbox. For a working-class woman with a frozen bank account, that single piece of paper was quite literally enough to change my entire life. But as I looked at the check, I did not feel relief. Instead, I thought about Elias Thorne. I thought about the old man I had encountered in the supermarket just yesterday. Julian desperately wanted me to believe that his uncle was a frail and delusional man who had completely lost his grip on reality. But I remembered the old man perfectly. When Elias leaned in to speak to me, there was absolutely zero confusion in his face. His eyes were not lost or wandering. His eyes were incredibly sharp, completely focused, and deeply calculating. He knew exactly who I was. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had meticulously set a trap, and he had specifically chosen me to spring it. I looked back up at Julian. I did not reach for the pen he had placed next to the check. Instead, I reached slowly into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once and placed the phone face up on the table right next to his $1 million bribe. The bright red circle of the voice memo application was actively blinking, recording every single word of his blatant extortion attempt. I told him the offer was rejected. My voice was steady and completely hollow of any fear. I told him that he had exactly 10 seconds to pick up his check and get out of my house before I sent the audio recording directly to the Chicago Police Department and every single local news station he claimed to control. Julian stared at the blinking red light on my phone. The polite billionaire mask completely shattered into absolute raw rage. The veins in his neck tightened. He snatched the check and the waiver from the table, his movements sharp and violently aggressive. He turned and walked directly to the front door, stopping just a fraction of a second before he crossed the threshold. He did not say another word, but the look he gave me before turning away promised absolute destruction. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him, rattling the cheap picture frames hanging on my living room walls. The quiet finally returned to my house, but the air felt entirely different now. The line had been crossed. This was no longer just a legal dispute over a frozen bank account. It was a fight for survival, and I knew with terrifying certainty that there was absolutely no going back. Valerie Cruz operated out of a corner office on the 42nd floor overlooking the Chicago River. The room smelled like expensive leather and absolute authority. Maya and I sat across from her massive oak desk while Valerie reviewed the freezing order Julian had filed against me. Maya did not waste a single second. She opened her laptop and immediately began tearing into the public financial filings of the Thorne estate. This was our silent counterattack. While Julian thought I was sitting at home crying over my unpaid mortgage, I was sitting in a room with two of the most dangerous women in the city. Valerie was dissecting the legal traps Julian had set, looking for the exact flaw in his court filings. But Maya was looking for something much deeper. She was looking for the motive. Valerie dropped the legal file onto her desk and looked at me. She asked the one question that had been keeping me awake for 3 nights straight. Why you? Why did Elias Thorne, a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, bypass his entire family, his board of directors, and his charitable foundations to leave $24 million to a 911 dispatcher he had never met? I shook my head. I told her I did not know. I told her I had never crossed paths with the man. I do not run in billionaire circles. I do not attend high society galas. My entire life consists of working 12-hour night shifts, going to the grocery store, and paying down a mortgage on a small house in the suburbs. Maya stopped typing and looked up from her screen. She said that wealthy men like Elias Thorne do not do anything by accident. They do not pick random names out of a phone directory to hand over a fortune. They are obsessed with control and legacy. If he chose me, it was a deliberate and calculated strike. Valerie agreed. She began pacing across the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She said Elias knew his nephew Julian would challenge the transfer. He knew Julian would freeze my accounts. He knew Julian would try to destroy my reputation to force a quick settlement. Elias was a master chess player. He was using me to force Julian into a public courtroom. But why me? I asked again, the frustration finally bleeding into my voice. Why choose someone who does not have the money or the power to fight back against a billionaire? Maya turned her laptop screen toward me. She had pulled up a timeline of Elias Thorne over the last 5 years. She pointed to a specific date on the screen. She said he did not choose me for my money, and he did not choose me for my legal connections. She looked me dead in the eye and said he chose me because of what I do for a living. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I do not meet people in person. I meet them on the absolute worst day of their lives over a recorded telephone line. If Elias Thorne knew who I was, it was not because he ever saw my face. It was because he heard my voice. And suddenly I knew exactly where I needed to look. Maya turned her attention back to her computer screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the brutal speed of someone tearing down a wall brick by brick. She was not just looking at standard tax filings anymore. She had bypassed the polished corporate summaries and was digging straight into the raw public ledger of the Thorne Venture Fund. Look at the cash flow over the last 14 months, she said, keeping her eyes locked on the monitor. Julian has been the chief executive officer for 2 years. He paints himself as a financial genius, but his investment portfolio is bleeding. He made 3 massive bets on commercial real estate right before the market completely tanked. He was looking at a total loss of nearly $50 million. Valerie walked over and stood behind Maya, looking over her shoulder at the cascading rows of numbers. So how did he cover the loss? Valerie asked. Maya hit a key and a new spreadsheet populated on the screen. She pointed to a series of transfers listed under miscellaneous operational expenses. He did not cover it, she replied. He stole it. He created a series of shell companies registered in Delaware and classified them as independent consulting firms. Then he slowly started bleeding the primary Thorne Trust dry. He was shifting millions of dollars out of his grandfather account to cover his own catastrophic failures. I sat forward in my chair, feeling the cold reality of the situation snap into place. Julian was not just an arrogant billionaire trying to protect his inheritance. He was an executive committing massive corporate fraud. And Elias figured it out, Maya said, her voice dropping an octave. Look at this date right here. 6 weeks before Elias Thorne died, he hired an independent forensic auditing firm from New York. He bypassed his own board of directors to do it. He knew his grandson was robbing him blind, and he was building a legal case to completely destroy Julian and remove him from the company permanently. Valerie crossed her arms tight against her chest. If Elias fired Julian and exposed the embezzlement, Julian would go to federal prison for a very long time, she said. But Elias died before the audit could be published. And the moment the old man was in the ground, Julian canceled the audit and sealed the records. The silence in the office was deafening. The pieces were finally locking together. Julian was terrified of the $24 million transfer because he thought it was a mistake that might trigger an automatic financial review by the federal government. But he was even more terrified of the alternative. Elias did not just leave me money. He left me a massive glowing beacon pointing directly at his grandson. Julian had everything to lose, and he was willing to do absolutely anything to stop me from looking closer. I left Valerie's office and drove straight home. I walked into my bedroom and pulled a heavy metal lockbox from the top shelf of my closet. Inside was an encrypted external hard drive. In my line of work, you learn very early to protect yourself. When a call involves a high-profile citizen or a suspicious near-death incident, dispatchers often request legal copies of the audio through their union representative. It is a safeguard against being blamed if things go wrong. I had backed up the audio of my most critical and traumatizing calls over the last 12 years. I sat at my kitchen table and plugged the drive into my laptop. My hands were finally steady. I did not search for financial records or estate documents. I searched my audio logs for the date November 3rd, exactly 3 years ago. The search bar loaded for a few seconds before producing a single audio file. I clicked on it. I put on my headphones and pressed play. The audio was crisp and clean. It started with the standard automated beep of the 911 system connecting. Then I heard my own voice asking the caller to state their emergency. The response on the recording was the horrifying sound of an older man gasping for air. It was a harsh, ragged wheezing, the unmistakable sound of a massive cardiac event. I heard a phone clatter loudly against a hardwood floor. Then a second voice came on the line. The voice was smooth, incredibly calm, and entirely devoid of any natural human panic. It was Julian Thorne. On the recording, Julian told me his grandfather was having a severe heart attack. I immediately asked for the address. Julian gave me a location on the extreme south side of Chicago, near an abandoned industrial sector. He calmly stated they were out inspecting a warehouse property and needed an ambulance immediately. But as I listened to the playback, I remembered exactly what my computer screen had shown me that night. The Phase 2 cell phone pinged the exact GPS location bouncing from the caller phone to the dispatch satellite did not match the industrial address Julian was giving me. They were not on the south side. The GPS coordinates placed them inside a heavily gated residential estate in the wealthy northern suburbs nearly 20 miles away in the complete opposite direction. Julian was intentionally sending the paramedics to the wrong side of the city. He was buying time. He was going to stand in that room and quietly watch his grandfather suffocate to death. On the audio, I heard myself instructing Julian to begin chest compressions immediately. Julian responded smoothly, saying he did not know how to do it and that he was too panicked to help. But his voice was completely flat. There was no fear. He was just waiting for the clock to run out. That was when my dispatch training took over. On the recording, my voice completely changed. It dropped into a cold, absolute command. I told Julian that I had his real GPS coordinates. I told him paramedics were already routed to his exact location at the northern estate, and that Chicago police officers were less than 2 minutes behind them. I told him very clearly that this federal line was being recorded, and if the police walked through his front door and found him standing over his dying grandfather, doing absolutely nothing to assist, he would be arrested for negligent homicide. I heard Julian curse under his breath. The sound was faint but absolutely undeniable. Then I heard the phone drop again, followed by the heavy rhythmic sound of forced chest compressions. I had backed him into a corner. I had forced him to keep Elias alive until the paramedics broke through the door. I saved Elias Thorne by refusing to believe the lie his grandson was telling. I took off my headphones and stared at the screen. A cold chill washed over my entire body. Everything made perfect, terrifying sense now. Elias Thorne did not leave me $24 million as a simple gesture of gratitude. It was a brilliantly constructed Trojan horse. Elias knew that if he simply went to the police with his suspicions, Julian would use his immense corporate wealth to bury the evidence, bribe the right people, and seal the records forever. So Elias used his own fortune as bait. He gave $24 million to the exact person who held the undeniable audio proof of Julian committing a felony. Elias knew Julian was entirely too greedy and too arrogant to let that money go. He knew Julian would sue me. He knew Julian would drag me into a public probate court. And by doing so, Julian would legally open the door for my attorney to submit this exact 911 recording into the public court record as discovery evidence. Elias had engineered the perfect trap from beyond the grave, and his greedy grandson was walking right into it. The heavy mahogany doors of the probate courtroom closed with a loud thud, sealing us inside. The room was massive with high vaulted ceilings and cold marble floors that seemed to drain the warmth directly out of the air. I sat at a small wooden table with Valerie. Directly across the aisle, Julian Thorne had assembled an absolute army. His legal team consisted of 6 high-priced corporate litigators dressed in identical dark suits, sitting behind a table stacked high with perfectly organized white binders. Julian sat right in the center of them, looking completely relaxed. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered me a small, arrogant smile across the room. He honestly believed he was about to watch my public execution. The presiding judge banged his wooden gavel, and the hearing officially began. Julian, lead attorney, a tall man with silver hair and a booming theatrical voice, stood up and immediately took control of the room. He did not hesitate. He launched into a vicious and meticulously rehearsed assassination of my character. He painted a picture of a desperate working-class woman drowning in mortgage debt who had manipulated her way into the life of a highly vulnerable billionaire. Then he brought out the medical records. He walked over and placed a thick stack of glossy documents directly onto the judge bench. He claimed they were certified evaluations from elite private neurologists, proving that Elias Thorne was suffering from severe advanced dementia during the final year of his life. The attorney read fabricated excerpts out loud to the courtroom, describing a frail, confused old man who suffered from intense paranoia and severe memory loss. He stated with absolute certainty that Elias entirely lacked the legal mental capacity to authorize a $24 million wire transfer. I sat perfectly still, listening to this wealthy lawyer twist my entire existence into something ugly and predatory. He brought up my frozen bank account. He brought up the fake human resources complaints at the dispatch center. He turned around to look directly at the crowded public gallery and called me a dangerous opportunist who preyed on the helpless elderly. The courtroom was dead silent, hanging on to his every single word. The air felt suffocating. Julian leaned back in his heavy leather chair, crossing his arms with absolute satisfaction. He was winning the optics, and he knew it. Through the entire 45-minute presentation, I did not flinch. I did not look down at my hands. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead. Valerie sat next to me, completely motionless, her hands resting calmly on our empty wooden table. We did not have massive binders of fabricated evidence. We did not have an army of paralegals whispering in our ears. We simply let the silver-haired attorney talk, building his massive, expensive tower of lies. He was so confident in his fake medical records and his ruthless character assassination. He had absolutely no idea that he was digging his client a federal prison cell right in the middle of the courtroom. The silver-haired attorney finally finished his long speech and took his seat. The heavy silence in the courtroom was thick and suffocating. The judge looked down from his high wooden bench directly at our small empty table. He adjusted his glasses and asked if the defense had any opening remarks or if we intended to cross-examine the medical experts who provided the dementia diagnosis. Valerie Cruz stood up. She did not button her suit jacket. She did not grab a yellow legal pad or pull out any massive binders of her own. She walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, holding absolutely nothing but a small silver USB drive between her thumb and index finger. "Your Honor," she said, her voice echoing clearly and sharply against the cold marble walls. "The plaintiff has just spent nearly an hour presenting highly expensive and highly theoretical medical opinions regarding the mental state of Elias Thorne. We have absolutely no intention of debating those fabricated documents. We do not need to argue about his state of mind today, because we can simply let Elias Thorne speak for himself." Julian shifted slightly in his heavy leather chair. The arrogant, confident smile on his face faltered for just a fraction of a second. His eyes locked onto the tiny piece of metal in Valerie's hand. Valerie approached the court clerk and handed over the small drive. She officially submitted it into the public court record as Defense Exhibit Number 1. She stated very clearly for the court reporter that the drive contained a certified and legally obtained emergency dispatch recording from November 3rd, exactly 3 years ago. Julian lead attorney immediately jumped to his feet. His booming theatrical voice was suddenly laced with genuine panic. He shouted an objection claiming that a 3-year-old audio file was completely irrelevant to a probate hearing about a recent financial wire transfer. He waved his hands and called it a desperate and inappropriate distraction from the medical facts. Valerie did not even look at the panicked lawyer. She kept her eyes locked entirely on the presiding judge. She explained that the audio recording was not a distraction at all. It was the direct and undeniable catalyst for the $24 million transfer. She stated that the money was not a clerical error or a random gift made by a confused and delusional old man. It was a deliberate and calculated payment for a specific service rendered. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. The entire gallery was dead silent. He looked at Valerie and asked exactly what kind of service a billionaire was paying a local 911 dispatcher for. Valerie turned slowly on her heels. She ignored the judge for a moment and looked directly across the room right into the terrified eyes of Julian Thorne. She stated that Elias Thorne was paying Chloe Bennett for saving his life on the exact night his own grandson actively attempted to murder him. The judge nodded slowly to the court clerk. The clerk took the silver drive from Valerie and plugged it into the main terminal of the courtroom media system. He pressed a single button on his keyboard. The heavy speakers mounted on the marble walls hissed with a brief second of static. Every single person in the gallery stopped moving. The room was so entirely quiet that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. The recording began with the sharp, automated beep of the 911 dispatch system. Then the horrifying sound of a man fighting for his life filled the massive room. It was Elias Thorne. His wet, desperate gasps echoed violently against the high vaulted ceilings. The raw, visceral sound of a massive cardiac event happening in real time was impossible to ignore. The silver-haired attorney for the plaintiff completely froze at his podium. He looked back at his client with wide, panicked eyes. Julian sat frozen in his heavy leather chair, staring up at the speakers as if they were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. Then a second voice came through the audio feed. It was Julian. He was not speaking directly into the receiver. He had dropped the phone and was leaning over his grandfather, completely unaware that the sensitive microphone was still capturing every single syllable in the room. His voice was not panicked. It was cold and entirely hollow. "Old man, just close your eyes," he muttered on the tape. "It will be over soon. Just let it happen." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the public gallery behind me. Several reporters in the back row immediately started typing frantically on their mobile devices. The judge slowly took off his glasses and stared down at Julian with absolute disgust. Then my voice cut through the audio feed. It was sharp, clear, and utterly unyielding. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as I exposed the lie. I stated the real coordinates out loud, proving that Julian had deliberately routed the ambulance to an abandoned industrial park on the wrong side of the city. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I told Julian that the police were 2 minutes away, and that if they found him standing over a dying man doing nothing, he would be arrested and charged with felony manslaughter. The heavy rhythmic thud of forced chest compressions began playing over the courtroom speakers, followed a few seconds later by the distant wail of approaching sirens. The audio file ended abruptly with the sound of a door being kicked open. The recording stopped, plunging the courtroom back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The entire false narrative Julian had purchased and built over the last 45 minutes was completely incinerated in exactly 2 minutes of audio. He did not look smug or arrogant anymore. His pristine billionaire facade was gone. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive fighting a probate battle. He was a man who had just broadcast his own attempted murder confession to a room full of lawyers and journalists. A low wave of whispers erupted across the public gallery behind me. The reporters in the back row were practically sprinting for the heavy wooden doors to file their breaking news stories. The judge pounded his gavel loudly against the block, but the sharp wooden cracks barely registered over the rising chaos in the room. The absolute brilliance of Elias Thorne was suddenly laid bare for the entire courtroom to see, and the realization was breathtaking. Valerie stepped back to the center of the floor. Her voice cut effortlessly through the noise, clear and relentless. She looked directly at the judge and laid out the absolute truth of the $24 million wire transfer. Elias Thorne was not suffering from dementia. I was the smartest man in this entire city. He knew exactly what his grandson was doing, and he knew the terrifying extent of Julian's power. If Elias had simply gone to the local police with his accusations, Julian would have used his massive corporate wealth to quietly bury the entire investigation. He would have bribed the right officials, intimidated the right witnesses, and sealed the police reports forever. If Elias had simply left his fortune to a random charity, Julian would have quietly tied the money up in endless private arbitration away from the public eye. So the old man had to design a flawless trap that his arrogant grandson could not possibly resist. He had to force Julian into a highly public courtroom where the press was watching and the federal record could never be erased. Elias transferred $24 million to the exact person holding the undeniable audio proof of his attempted murder. He did not do it as a simple thank you. He did it because he knew Julian was entirely too greedy and too proud to let a fortune like that walk out the door. He knew Julian would aggressively freeze the bank account. He knew Julian would hire expensive lawyers to sue me. And Elias knew with absolute certainty that by filing this exact lawsuit, Julian was actively bypassing his own protective corporate walls. By dragging me into a public probate hearing, Julian legally opened the door for our defense team to submit the 911 recording as official discovery evidence in a public forum. Elias Thorne had brilliantly weaponized his own death. He used his immense fortune as the ultimate bait, and he used his grandson's predictable greed to spring the trap. I looked across the aisle at Julian. He was slumped deeply in his chair, completely destroyed and pale. He finally understood that he had not been fighting a helpless dispatcher. He had been fighting the ghost of the man he tried to kill, and he had just lost everything. Julian Thorne sat completely paralyzed at the plaintiff table. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was permanently gone. The color drained from his face so quickly that his skin turned the shade of pale ash. His broad shoulders collapsed inward, and he slumped forward in his heavy leather chair. The absolute gravity of his own mistake was finally crushing him. He had successfully stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from the Thorne estate. He had hidden the massive corporate fraud perfectly. If he had just walked away and let me keep the $24 million, he would have remained a powerful and respected billionaire for the rest of his natural life. But his ego and his bottomless greed would not allow him to lose a single cent. He had to have it all. He could not stand the thought of a working-class dispatcher taking anything from his family empire. And because he reached for that final piece of the fortune, he had actively dug his own grave. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open. The loud thud echoed sharply over the whispers of the stunned public gallery. 2 uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department walked through the doors, followed immediately by 3 plainclothes agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not wait for the judge to formally dismiss the probate hearing. They walked straight down the center aisle with absolute and terrifying purpose. The lead federal agent bypassed the low wooden gate and walked directly up to the plaintiff table. He did not lower his voice to protect the dignity of the billionaire. He stated clearly for the entire silent courtroom to hear that Julian Thorne was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He listed the devastating charges one by one: massive corporate financial fraud, felony wire fraud, and the attempted premeditated murder of Elias Thorne. Julian did not try to fight back. He did not yell for his expensive corporate attorneys to do something. The legal team that he had paid thousands of dollars an hour simply backed away from him, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a sinking ship. Julian slowly stood up and placed his trembling hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly across the quiet room. The man who had walked into my house just a few days ago, claiming he owned the entire city of Chicago, was now being escorted out of the courtroom like a common criminal. His massive financial empire was completely reduced to ashes, and it was entirely destroyed by the exact same grandfather he had tried so desperately to bury. The legal machinery moved incredibly fast once the federal agents took Julian away. By 4:00 that same afternoon, the presiding judge officially dissolved the freezing order on my checking account. There were no more legal hurdles and no more corporate intimidation tactics. The $24 million was officially and irrevocably mine. I sat in Valerie's office and watched the secure bank confirmation populate on my mobile screen. It was no longer just a massive string of digital numbers. It was absolute freedom. It was the permanent end of counting pennies at the local grocery store and the end of fearing the bills in my mailbox. Elias Thorne had trusted me to finish his final brutal battle, and I had delivered exactly what he paid for. The next morning, my cell phone rang while I was sitting on my cheap fabric sofa drinking a cup of black coffee. The caller identification showed the Human Resources Department of the County Emergency Dispatch Center. I answered the call and listened to the regional director stumble over his own words. He sounded incredibly nervous and entirely out of his depth. He offered a long, desperate apology for my immediate suspension. He claimed their internal investigation was completely flawed, and he quickly blamed the false complaints on illegal external corporate pressure. He practically begged me to come back to the dispatch floor. He even offered me a senior supervisor position and promised to double my hourly salary effective immediately. I sat quietly and listened to the director panic for 3 solid minutes. Just 1 week ago, I would have done absolutely anything to keep that job. 1 week ago, the simple threat of losing my weekly paycheck was enough to make my chest physically ache with anxiety. But the world was entirely different now. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked around my quiet little living room. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation, and I did not gloat about my new bank balance. I simply told him that I appreciated his very generous offer, but my career in public emergency service was officially over. I pressed the red end call button and placed the phone face down on the wooden coffee table. The heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried for years was completely gone. The war was finally finished, and for the first time in my entire life, I had absolutely nothing but time. 2 weeks later, the morning air felt entirely different. The crushing humidity of the Chicago summer had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp and brilliant blue sky. I sat on the front porch of my small suburban house, resting my bare feet against the wooden railing. I held a warm ceramic mug of black coffee between my hands. Maya sat in the wicker chair right next to me, staring out at the quiet neighborhood street. There were no expensive corporate luxury cars parked at the curb. There were no process servers hiding in the shadows. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the mailbox at the end of my driveway did not hold a single past due notice or a threatening mortgage letter. The house was completely paid off. The title was clear. The absolute peace settling over the porch was so heavy and so profound that it almost felt physical. Maya took a slow sip of her coffee and smiled, looking at the bright morning sun. We did not need to talk about Julian Thorne. We did not need to talk about the federal indictments or the complete collapse of his fraudulent empire. The war was over, and the silence we shared now was built entirely on victory. I leaned back in my chair and watched the wind rustle through the green leaves of the oak tree in my front yard. I thought about the sheer arrogance of men like Julian, powerful predators who build massive towering empires on top of lies and cruelty. They operate under a very specific and fatal delusion. They genuinely believe that money can buy absolutely anything. They think wealth is a universal eraser, capable of wiping away their darkest sins and buying the total silence of anyone who stands in their way. But they always forget one fundamental truth about the world. They forget that there are people like me, people who operate in the shadows of the graveyard shift. We do not care about their luxury cars or their expensive tailored suits. We make our entire living sitting quietly in the dark, listening to the absolute worst moments of human existence. And no matter how much money they throw at the problem, they can never erase the fact that we are always listening and we are always permanently recording the truth.